Well, hello there. Uh, this video is being made specifically for a Bible class that I teach in a private school. It's being made generally for people who are just interested in the subject of the Bible. So I'll tell you up front, these videos will be made from an Orthodox Christian point of view, and I do that not just because I have to, but because I want to, right? So some of the stuff that you may hear may surprise you. Some of it you may disagree with. Some of you, some of it you may think is perhaps too conservative or too even permissive, according to your personal church denomination that you might belong to. Like right off the bat, I'll give you an example of that. I don't teach from the King James Bible. Okay, I don't have anything against the King James Bible, but I have a hard time reading it, and I'm an educated person, and remember I'm a teacher in a junior high and high school, and so I have to use a Bible translation that is appropriate for kids, and that's appropriate in an age when most people just don't read very much. And so I have found that my kids even struggle with the English Standard Version, and that's one that I'll be using. It's a nice, solid Bible translation, and it reads at approximately an 8th grade, ninth grade reading level, right in there. So again, if you're a King James only person, um, I don't teach out of the ESV to insult you, but it's just because that's what's more appropriate for my students, and so there you go. What I'm going to do, hopefully, and it's going to take me a while to get there because I've been teaching these lessons for years, but I'm just now getting them onto video. So I'll be teaching through the New Testament in my Bible classes this year, but in every one of my Bible classes, I always begin at the beginning. I start with the book of Genesis. And I will say this, and it'll sound odd, perhaps, if for you to hear this. The book of Genesis is the most important book in the Bible because it tells us how we got here, what went wrong, and how is God going to fix it, or it at least hints at the answer to, how is God going to fix it. And so whether you're studying the Old Testament or the New Testament, you have to be grounded in first things. And so that's what I always do in my Bible classes. I begin with Genesis chapters 1 through 11, and then I skip to the New Testament. Okay, so in my classes this year, in the 2020 to 2021 school year, I'll be teaching the New Testament, but like I said, I always begin with the Old, at least the first 11 chapters of Genesis. So if that sounds annoying to you, I bear with me because I think that you'll see why that makes sense. All right, so to begin at the beginning, Genesis chapter 1. Let me read verses 1 through 2, and these will be very familiar sounding to just about anyone. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Okay, we'll stop there for now, but some interesting little factoids for you here. The Hebrew word bara, okay, the book of Genesis, the Bible begins, I think, from what I remember of my Hebrew, which was never very good, but Bereshith bara Elohim Hashemayim Ve'eth Haaretz. Isn't that right? Yeah. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay. Now, the Hebrew word bara, to create, that's only used when speaking of God and what He does. So in the Hebrew way of thinking, humans make things, but only God creates things. That's a very important concept. In the English language, we use the word create in a pretty sloppy way. You know, Gordon Ramsay can create a new type of lasagna or something like that. And so in English, we use the word create very loosely. In Hebrew, not so. It's used of God because the Bible teaches that creation is you've got God and nothing else, and then God speaks things into existence and thus creates them. Okay, now that's familiar to anybody who's been trained in the Christian faith. We think that's a normal way to think about things. Let me assure you, it is not normal for people to think that at one point there was just God and then He creates things from nothing. All right, so, well, if this is creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing, what alternatives are there? What else could you believe if you didn't believe that? Well, there are lots of them, actually, lots of alternatives. The first one is this, okay? Stuff creates itself, organizes itself, even though stuff doesn't think or act. Now, when you put the theory of evolution so simply, kind of in junior high language, it should jump out at you as kind of dumb. The idea that stuff creates itself and then organizes itself, even though stuff doesn't have a mind. Okay, now that's, again, that sound, when you put it that crudely, it sounds dumb. Okay, so that's one alternative to creation out of nothing. We'll talk more about evolution here in a minute. Here's a good one. I took a class in college called the Philosophy of Biology in a public university, and it was a very interesting class. But this was one of the theories offered, okay, in a secular university, that beings from another dimension provided the stuff, the matter of the universe, and then they let evolution do the work through billions of years. Okay, so in other words, you have this dimension that we live in, and then beings from another dimension somehow crossed the barrier into this one, and then they planted the seeds of the universe here, and then over the course of billions, presumably, of years, these aliens had placed into matter the organizing principles of matter, so like gravity or whatever. Okay, and that periodically throughout history, even prehistory, these aliens were somehow supervising or directing this evolution. Now, when you talk about aliens and other dimensions, again, this sounds like pretty dumb. Now, that, like I said, that idea was brought up in a science class in college. And the thing that the movie that always pops into my mind here is if you look at filmmakers and their top 10 movies ever made, and a lot of directors will even say it's in their top 5, and that's 2001: A Space Odyssey. That takes exactly this view. Okay, so you've got the the monolith. At first, you've got just monkey men running around, and then the monolith just shows up. And when the eerie music is playing, then you know that the aliens are about to do something interesting. And so you never see the aliens. You don't. It's just that the stone monolith shows up, and then the apes gather around it, and they touch it, and this mysterious magnetism or energy coming off of it then causes an upgrade in the apes, and they start figuring some stuff out. So one of them starts playing with a big old bone that he finds, and he realizes, wait, you can smash things with this. And then he figures out, I can smash the heads of the pig-like creature and kill it, and then I can eat it. And so then you can see that his little group of monkey men, they start to stand more upright, and they get better at fighting, and they take back their water hole that they lost to some mean people or monkeys. And so that's the first step in evolution, or one of the first steps in evolution, I guess. And supposedly that causes the first step towards humanity. And then the movie skips forward billions of years to 2001, I guess. And you see a space station on its way to the moon. Okay, so that view, like option 2, that beings from another dimension have planted the seeds of matter, and then they've been supervising evolution ever since. It sounds dumb when you put it that way, but a really great movie was made based on that. I'm not saying I agree with it. Just in terms of making a movie, it's you got to see it. It's one of the best movies ever made, even though the ideas in it are garbage. Okay, option 3. Well, before I move on to option 3, here's something to think about. If aliens popped into our dimension and then planted the seeds of the world, where did those aliens come from? Who made them? So you can't just push this back infinitely and say, well, another group of aliens popped into their dimension. Well, where did those ones come from? Well, you see another group of aliens popped into their dimension. That doesn't work. Eventually you have to hit a first cause. There has to be, in theological language, there has to be the uncaused cause. So that theory clearly doesn't work. All right. A third option, Greek mythology. And Greek mythology is not the only type of mythology there is, obviously. Every ancient civilization had its own mythology. Some of them are so simple, just really, really simple, and not very interesting because they're simple. But every group of clever pagans had to come up with some explanation on how the world came to be. And of the mythologies that I've studied, the Greek myth is by far the most meaningful and kind of psychologically perceptive. Pretty clever, a lot of the ideas that they come up with. Some of them are silly, and some of them were clearly made just for entertainment purposes. But some of it's pretty clever. I mean, given the fact that they were not God's chosen people and didn't have Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, they didn't know this, so they had to kind of figure it out. So with Greek mythology, you've got Gaia, Mother Earth, and you've got Uranus, heaven or the sky or space. It's all of that, I guess. And if you imaginatively depict Uranus, heaven, and Gaia, Earth, as living gods or goddesses, the two of them from time immemorial have been kind of staring at each other, and the love that develops between them, Gaia just starts bringing forth life. And Gaia being a mom, moms don't judge their kids based on how handsome or ugly they are. Moms just love their kids, right? And that's kind of how Gaia was. There are all these titans and monsters and all sorts of horrible things. Some beautiful things too, but Gaia just likes them. And so Uranus doesn't like all of them, and from what I remember, he starts locking some of them up because they're just dangerous. And so after a while, Gaia kind of talks some of the kids into rebelling, and Kronos, Time, he shows up, and he fixes Uranus so that he has to flee, and then Kronos, or Time, takes over. And that's an interesting idea, that time is more powerful even than the heavens are. So that's why I'm saying that the Greek mythology is the most interesting of all the wrong mythologies there are. You can get the O'Lear's book on Norse mythology. It's really interesting. It's not quite as clever as the Greeks, and it's a little bit more streamlined. But anyway, so that's another type of explanation on how the world got here. And if you look at it closely, you realize that Greek mythology itself is a form of evolution. That's what it's saying, is that the powers of the world, whether it's the soil, earth, or the sky, the light and things that come from the sky, if you use your imagination and you turn those things into persons or gods, then you basically have created your own really interesting theory of evolution, and that's basically what Greek mythology is. Okay. Now here's an interesting one, and this one is so utterly foreign to the way Western people think that it's often not mentioned. And by Western, I mean Western Hemisphere. I'm not talking Arizona. That's not what I mean by Western. I'm just saying that in the way that Westerners, Europeans, think, okay, which is heavily conditioned by Christianity. But when you look far to the east, to the Hindus in particular, their view of creation is that it's not really creation. It's everything that exists is like an emanation. Now that's pretty complicated, and it's kind of weird. And when you look at their religious teachings, you realize that they've got their own concept of ultimate reality, and they give that a name, Brahman. And in some of my classes we talk about Hinduism and Buddhism. Both of those make use of the idea of Brahman. But Brahman is like the ground of being, the ocean of existence, something like that. And Brahman is not personal, so you can't talk to Brahman. but Brahman, out of its own fullness, just kind of emanated forth everything that we see, including people. And all people and all living things contain a kind of a spark or a droplet, if that works better in your mind. So Brahman, if Brahman is like this ocean of being, then droplets of that ocean have descended to the earth, and each of us have Brahman within us. And when Brahman is within us, it's called Atman. So each human being and each animal, in fact, shares in Brahman's ultimate reality. But that's a very different idea than humans being created in the image of God. That's not what Hindus believe. Okay? So, from a Hindu point of view, the universe is here as a projection. It's almost like a hologram in some sense. It doesn't have ultimate reality. The only ultimate reality is Brahman, and the goal for living things like you and me is to get back to Brahman and to disappear into this ocean of being. Okay, does that sound like an appealing thing to you? That your ultimate goal in life is to be reabsorbed into an ocean of unconscious being? So that's why Hinduism has made no real inroads into Western civilization, because we just don't think that way. We don't. Okay. All right, now we've talked about several different options for the theory of for the biblical teaching on creation. It's not a theory. The most simple, the most elegant, it explains the most in the simplest way, is that an all-powerful God who has always existed created everything out of nothing. And that's the biblical teaching. And this all-powerful God is personal. You can talk to him and he understands you. Okay? So that's a super important doctrine, the doctrine of God creating the heavens and the earth out of nothing by his own word. To us, if you've been raised in the church, if you've ever been to Sunday school or vacation Bible school, you know these things and you think that's how people normally think. It's not how people normally think. All right, so keep that in mind. Very common these days amongst a lot of Christians is the theory of theistic evolution. And that's the theistic from the root word theos, meaning God. So that's the idea that God created the earth in a general sense. He's put it there. And then he put forces, built things into matter that through time, through gravity and other different physical forces, God superintended creation, but he let it come together over the course of billions of years. Now there are some serious weaknesses to this view. It's a compromised form of Christianity. One of my favorites, C.S. Lewis, he definitely taught theistic evolution. He absolutely did. And a lot of college professors and such, they kind of have, I'm not going to say have to, but if they want to get a tenured teaching position in a university, they kind of have to, because that's like the official position of the world, is that evolution is true, right? So anyway, there are theistic evolutionists out there. I think that you can be a Christian and hold to this view. I think that there are some serious weaknesses to it, and I will talk about some of those weaknesses. But if you as a Christian run up against a guy who's got, a PhD in astrophysics or something like that, and you're trying to tell him about Jesus, don't set 6-day creation as the be all and end all of becoming a Christian. Don't put that in front of that astrophysicist just yet. Okay? Because he may not be able to get over that hump right now. Maybe he'll rethink it later. So don't make literal 6 24-hour days of creation. Don't let that be the thing that turns someone off to hearing about Christ. Okay, so don't go there. That would be my suggestion for you. All right. Now here's a good way of keeping this in mind. And when you look at the real aggressive internet atheist types on YouTube and stuff, you can kind of cut to the chase with them, because there are really only two options in creation. It's the dilemma of two eternals. Either matter is eternal or God is eternal, because the theory of evolution, of Darwinian evolution, depends on the idea that the universe just exists. And you don't have to explain it, where it comes from. It's just here. So let's forget all that. They always want you to just forget all of that. They want you to move past that. Don't move past that. Just say, no, I want to know where things came from. Where did the matter come from? Because either matter is eternal or God is eternal, but you can't have both. You just can't. So that's a good tool to use if you're talking to this, an aggressive evolutionist. And a lot of them are super aggressive. All right. Now here's a question for you. What are human beings? As you can tell, you're going to give a different answer based on your theory of how we got here. All right. So if evolution were correct, would humans be any more valuable than dolphins? I'm talking about what do they call them? The bottlenose dolphins, the ones that you see at SeaWorld and all that. There are different species of porpoise and dolphin, but I'm talking about the big one. Okay. If evolution were correct, would humans be any more valuable than dolphins? The answer is no. We wouldn't be. In fact, on our planet today, we've got, 7.5 billion people? We're pushing up to 8 billion here pretty soon. Okay? And yet, there may be a few 100,000 of these dolphins in the oceans of the world. I don't know exactly the number, but it's nowhere near even 1 billion, I guarantee you. So just in terms of rarity, dolphins are much more valuable, in the same sense that gold is more valuable than lead, because there's a lot more lead out there. All right. So that's something to think about. If evolution is true, then the importance of human beings is downgraded severely. We're just a different version of meat, if evolution is true. That's pretty depressing. It should be depressing. When you leave God out of it, you should be depressed. Okay. All right, so now here's another thing to think about. If evolution were correct, how would you explain mankind's freedom of choice? All right, most of us have had this experience. I'm a Gen Xer, so I grew up before we had cell phones. Can you imagine? There was a time before cell phones. In fact, I'm old enough to remember when a phone was usually this ugly green or yellow object that had a wheel on it, and you stuck your finger in there and went okay, and it was in the kitchen usually, and it had a cord on it, and you could walk about, if you had a long cord, you could walk maybe 8 feet away from the phone before you ran out of phone cord. You had to go back. All right, so that's kind of how I got here. And because there was no phones to play on, whenever you went to visit a relative, especially an older relative like my grandparents, I'd go over there and they had a big box of dominoes in the closet. And my brother and I would take the dominoes and we'd find a hard surface somewhere and we would stack them. You know the drill. You put them on end and you can make a snaky pattern on the floor. And if you do it right, and you tip the first domino and it hits the second one, which hits the third, okay, and it goes all the way around and all the dominoes tip over. Okay, so dominoes don't have free choice. If you have 300 dominoes lined up, does domino number 156 have a choice on whether or not it falls over? No, it just does. Okay. That's how matter is. Matter, things bump into each other and they either make things bounce off or they give way. That's what matter does. Bumps into stuff and makes things happen. Okay. Now, by the theory of evolution, you and I, we're just matter. We're stuff. So how do we explain the fact that if we're just stuff, then how do we have this freedom to choose things? And how do we have this freedom to choose actions that will actually harm us or put us in harm's way? How do you account for that? Because dominoes don't choose whether or not they fall down. Dogs and cats. Okay, you may think that your dog is pretty smart. Mine happens to be incredibly stupid. But if you take a dog and you stick him in a cage for 3 days and you don't feed him, and then you let him out, and the only thing in the yard to eat is like let's say that you had a squirrel and you dazed it, you kind of hit it or something. I'm not saying you should do this. This is an example. Okay. So your dog, he's been without food for 3 days, and you finally let him out, and the only thing in the yard is a squirrel that you've dazed, and the squirrel's just kind of lying there. It's moving, but it's not really aware. Does the dog have a choice on whether or not he will eat the squirrel? He really doesn't. The dog has a canine nature, and a dog is going to eat that squirrel. He may not like the taste of it. He's probably never eaten a still living thing like that before because he's a pet, you know. But your dog's going to eat the squirrel, and it's because he's got a programmed nature. He's got to eat. He's going to. On the other hand, you can take a human being and let's say that you take that human being and you stick him in a jail cell for 3 days and you don't feed him or give him anything to drink. And you take him out of the jail cell and you put something in front of him that may be pretty vile to eat, you know, use your imagination. It's edible, but does that human have a choice whether or not he eats it? The answer is yes. Okay? By force of will and by a decision he makes up in here, he can say, I'm not eating that. I'd rather die. Lots of prisoners have gone on hunger strikes before, and they're hungry, and they choose, for the sake of a higher ideal, they choose to not eat. Explaining where that freedom to choose comes from is very, very difficult. I think it's impossible for an evolutionist to explain that. Because after all, if evolution is true, your brain is just meat. Now it's got electrical stuff going on in it, but ultimately your brain is just matter, right? If you're an evolutionist. So they can't explain this sort of human freedom. Okay. Now, the book of Genesis, it tells us how we got here. It tells us why God put us here, and it tells us how the world got so messed up. And remember, I mentioned this earlier, all religions try to answer two questions, and they may not even do this self-consciously, but all religions have to answer two questions. What is wrong with the world, and how is God going to fix it? Period. All religions have to answer those two. Okay. If you have never wondered what is wrong with the world, then this probably explains why you've never had an interest in Christianity. If you've watched this much of the video, I think you do have an interest in Christianity. But keep in mind, a lot of my students through the years, my Bible class that I teach in junior high or whatever, that may literally be the first time they've ever held a Bible in their hands. Okay, that happens. And I don't want them to feel bad for that. I'm just glad they're in my class. But America has a lot of people in it now who they don't seem to wonder that much about how we got here or how the world got messed up. They just kind of accept things as they are. They don't think about it that much. All right. Most people look at Christianity as a bunch of rules that are designed to make us unhappy. And this is an interesting little exercise I do. I always ask a new Bible class to define the word freedom. What is it? This is almost always what they say, some variation of this. They will say that freedom is the opportunity to do what I want, so long as I don't hurt people or damage their property. That's a fairly sophisticated answer. I've been to college and I know words and stuff. But a lot of my, junior high kids, they would just say, freedom is it's the ability to do what I want. That's what they mean. Okay. Now, to show you how messed up that is, here is freedom from a biblical perspective, from a Christian perspective. Here's what freedom is. Freedom, from God's point of view, is the opportunity and the ability to do God's will all of the time. Now, how many 13-year-olds think that that is true freedom? They don't. Okay? None of them do. 13-year-olds want to push the boundaries and they want to do what they want. Some of them do that openly. Some of them do it secretly. Some of them fear what their parents will do, and some do fear God. But all 13-year-olds are aware there's something going on where I don't want to do God's will all of the time. That doesn't even sound interesting to me. It didn't sound interesting to me when I was 13, I guarantee you, even though I was in Sunday school every week. Okay. So, something happened to the human race to make us not be interested in God's sort of freedom. All right, so I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. Now, the word Elohim, that's a very interesting word because in Hebrew it is plural in form, even though it's almost always singular in use. Okay? So is there something about God that is both singular and plural at the same time? Now that's a really interesting question. All right. So let me read a few verses here. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Okay, so in each of those cases where the word God appears, it's the Hebrew word Elohim, and that word in the context is translated God with a capital G, O, and D. It's singular. There are other places in the Old Testament where the word Elohim is translated gods, plural, with a small g. So Moses and Aaron speaking against the gods, Elohim, of Egypt, right? So that's a very peculiar word, that it's singular and plural at the same time, and we're going to talk more about that later when we get to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. All right. Now verse 3, something to think about. Where did the light come from if the sun was not created until day 4? Okay. This early on in the Bible, you've already got another conflict with the scientists and the atheists and the philosophers and the angry internet, YouTube know-it-alls. They're going to say that's just dumb that there was light before the sun was even created. Okay? From a Christian perspective, it's very simple. God is the light who shines upon his own creation. Okay? So God didn't create himself. He's always been, and now this light is in relationship with the creation that's out there. Okay? So even early on here, we're already facing a choice. Will we take a biblical worldview into the world, and are we willing to maintain that even though people are going to be aggressively questioning what we say and do? So later on in the New Testament, of course, Jesus says this is a very stark decision that all of us face. He said that he did not come to bring peace on earth, but a sword, because the members of a household will be divided against one another over who Jesus is. So, and thus has it always been. It's always been this, between those who maintain what God says about the world and where it came from, and those who say, no, we just came here, we're just here as the product of evolution over the course of billions of years. And, if I'm really honest, then I guess I'd have to admit that we're actually less valuable than dolphins. Okay? So, from the very beginning, this separation between God's way of looking at things and man's way of looking at things, it begins. And that's why Genesis is so important, because we need to talk about these things before we can make sense of the world around us. Okay, I'm going to end there. This 45 minutes, and I'm only I've only read as far as verse 9, I guess. So there's lots more. And I hope this has been helpful to you. Keep studying on your own and pray to God for wisdom. Thank you for listening and spending your time with me today. You have a good one. Bye.